The morning Evander Quillethe told his mother he was in love with a boy, she dropped her rosary beads into the kitchen sink and watched them sink into the soapy water without making a single move to retrieve them. She stood there with her back to him, shoulders drawn up toward her, ears like two wings folding inward, her breath coming in shallow, controlled sips, the way it did when she was trying very hard not to say the things she most wanted to say. Evander stood in the doorway between the hallway and the kitchen, still in his sleep clothes, heart hammering so loudly in his own chest that he was half convinced she could hear it bouncing off the refrigerator and the yellow walls and the small, framed cross above the stove. But this story does not begin there. In that kitchen, in that terrible stillness between a mother and her son, it begins 17 years earlier, in the patchy grass between two adjoining garden fences in a quiet, sun-baked town called Marrow Hollow, where two small boys discovered each other the way only children can, completely, recklessly, without any of the armor that age eventually teaches you to wear. Evander Quillethe was 5 years old when his family moved into the house at the end of Duskpine Lane, and he remembers almost nothing of that first day except the heat and the boxers and the way his father kept saying, "This is a good Christian neighborhood. Son, these are our kind of people." He remembers the smell of fresh paint in his new bedroom and the way the curtains were the wrong color, a sickly lemon yellow that made the afternoon light feel jaundiced. And he remembers standing in the back garden alone while the adults carried furniture and sweated and argued about where the sofa should go, feeling the particular loneliness of a child in an unfamiliar place. He did not expect the face that appeared above the wooden fence slats, sudden and round and framed by an explosion of dark curly hair, brown eyes wide with the unashamed curiosity that belongs only to the very young. The face stared at him. Evander stared back. There was a long moment of the kind of profound mutual assessment that children conduct without any self-consciousness whatsoever, the way animals do, direct and serious, and entirely without pretense. Then the face said, in a voice that was slightly too loud for the distance between them, "My name is Oberon Tasse, and I am 5 3/4, and I have a beetle in a jar if you want to see it." Evander said yes immediately, because what else do you say to that? And within 10 minutes they were both crouched in the dirt on Oberon's side of the fence, examining the beetle with the gravity of two scientists on the verge of a breakthrough. And that was that. That was the beginning of everything. Oberon Tasse was the kind of boy who made the world feel more interesting simply by being in it, which is a rare and slightly dangerous quality in a person. He had his mother's dark curls, and his father's stubborn jaw, and a laugh that was too big for his small body and that cracked open any room it entered. He collected things, feathers, smooth stones, bottle caps, words he liked the sound of, and he kept them all in a battered wooden box under his bed that he called his museum, and he showed every item to Evander with the same reverent seriousness. As if each one were a holy relic, Evander was quieter, more watchful, the kind of child who observed a situation from all angles before committing to it, who listened more than he spoke and felt things more deeply than his small face usually revealed. He was the one who remembered things, the exact words Oberon had said on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago, the precise color of the sky on the afternoon they found the injured bird in the churchyard, the specific way that Oberon tilted his head to the left when he was thinking hard about something. Evander filed these details away without knowing why, with the unconscious diligence of someone who understands on some cellular level that this person, this particular warm and chaotic and laughing person, is important in a way that must be preserved. Their families were friendly in the way that neighboring families in small towns are friendly barbecues on bank holidays. A borrowed cup of flour here, a wave across the fence there, but underneath the pleasantness there was a theological difference that both sets of parents were too polite to name directly but never forgot. The Quillethe household was Southern Baptist in the most thorough and uncompromising sense. Sunday services without exception, grace before every meal. The Bible open on the kitchen counter the way other families left cookbooks. The Tasse family were not religious in any formal way, but they held their own particular orthodoxy, a hard-edged working-class pride that had no room for softness, for what Oberon's father, Gareth, called weakness, a word he deployed like a weapon, to cover a broad and somewhat mysterious category of behaviors he disliked. The boys grew up in the space between these two households, in the gap between the fences, in the 10-foot stretch of alley that separated their back gardens, where they built a den out of old pallets and a piece of corrugated roofing and 2 stolen sofa cushions. They spent entire summers in that den, eating biscuits and reading comics and talking with the effortless velocity of 2 people who are each other's most natural audience, who finish each other's sentences not because they are showing off, but because they genuinely know what the other one is going to say. By the time they were 8, they had developed a private language of looks and gestures so fluent that their classmates found it mildly unnerving. By 10, they had seen each other cry, really cry, not the performative tears of a scraped knee, but the deep, ugly crying that comes from being humiliated or genuinely frightened. And this mutual witnessing had created between them a bond of the particular and unbreakable kind that is only forged in that specific fire. By 12, Evander had begun to notice things about Oberon that he could not entirely explain and did not try to. The way the afternoon sun looked in Oberon's dark curls, the way Oberon's voice had begun its gradual descent and was cracking in, ways that were somehow simultaneously funny and deeply compelling. He did not have a name for what he noticed. He was 12 years old in a small religious town, and the only name he had ever heard attached to what he was beginning to feel was spoken in a tone of voice that made it clear the word was a diagnosis, a deviation, an error. So he did not name it. He put it in a box the way Oberon put his treasures in a box, and he put the box somewhere dark and did not look directly at it. And he went on being Evander, and Oberon went on being Oberon, and the world continued turning with its customary indifference. They started secondary school together, and this ought to have been the point where their friendship diluted, as friendships between boys that age often do when the social sorting begins, when the hierarchies establish themselves and the performance of a particular kind of masculinity becomes mandatory. But the sorting somehow left them together. Perhaps because Oberon was charming and athletic enough to neutralize any suspicion that their closeness invited. Perhaps because Evander was sharp enough and sardonic enough to wear his quietness as a choice rather than a failing. They remained, against the odds of adolescent social physics, inseparable. There were girls, of course, because there had to be, because the script demanded it. Oberon dated a girl named Petra Sunholm in year 9, and Evander watched this from a careful distance and felt something he identified at the time as simple jealousy of the ordinary variety. The kind you feel when your best friend's attention is redistributed. He told himself this with great conviction. He was very good at telling himself things with great conviction. He had been practicing for years. Oberon broke up with Petra after 6 weeks and showed up at Evander's bedroom window at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, which was a thing he did periodically with no apparent awareness of how extraordinary it was, climbing the oak tree outside Evander's window with the ease of someone who had done it so many times. The tree had essentially become a staircase. He sat on Evander's windowsill with his legs hanging outside and said it just felt wrong. The whole thing, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. And Evander sat on his bed and looked at him in the lamplight and nodded and said, "Some things feel like that." and did not say anything else, and they sat together in the easy silence of two people for whom silence has never been empty. Evander had his own obligatory, romantic episode in year 10. A brief and puzzling entanglement with a girl called Saffron Lyle, who was clever and funny and entirely lovely, and for whom he felt a genuine warmth that was completely, maddeningly distinct from what he felt when Oberon Tasse walked into a room. He recognized the difference by then. He was 15, and the walls of his private box were beginning to show cracks, and the recognition was arriving whether he invited it or not. A slow, unstoppable seep of truth through all his careful containment. He ended things with Saffron as kindly as he could and felt terrible about it. Not because he had lost something, but because he understood for the first time with horrible clarity that he was never going to want what his father wanted him to want. What the church wanted, what the framed cross above the stove and the Sunday mornings and the grace before meals were all pointing toward. He lay on his bed that night and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular cold, specific terror of knowing something about yourself that you cannot unknow and cannot yet afford to say out loud. The summer they were 16 was the summer everything began to shift in ways that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. They were taller by then, both of them, Oberon having grown with a sudden, reckless enthusiasm that year that had left him broad-shouldered and loose-limbed, and Evander lean and angular in a way that Oberon once described, with typical unself-conscious accuracy, as like someone made of interesting angles. They spent that summer the way they had spent every summer before it, in the den that they had long since upgraded from pallets and corrugated metal to actual chairs and a battered camping lantern, but something in the atmosphere had changed. Taken on a new charge, a new self-consciousness. It was the summer Evander began to understand what the word longing meant from the inside. It is one thing to read the word in a book and understand its dictionary definition, and quite another to feel it in your own body, to understand it as a physical phenomenon, as the specific ache of wanting something that is right there, present, and warm and close enough to touch, and knowing with a certainty that is also a kind of grief, that you cannot touch it. Must not touch it, that the touching would be the end of everything. He became, in the way of people carrying large unspoken things, very slightly better at hiding and very slightly worse at being fully present. He laughed a beat later than he used to. He occasionally caught himself staring at Oberon in the lamplight with an expression that he would hastily reassemble into something neutral whenever Oberon looked over. He was meticulous about this. He was absolutely certain he was getting away with it. He was not getting away with it. Oberon Tasse had his own box, his own careful inventory of unexamined things, and if Evander was practiced at not looking at his, Oberon was practiced at burying his so deep that he could sometimes go entire weeks without registering it at all, which is a different strategy, but not ultimately a more effective one. Oberon had known something was different about the way he thought about Evander since he was about 13. Had filed it under confusion, and then under it doesn't mean anything, and then under something we don't talk about, which was the category his father had established for a broad range of human experiences, from vulnerability to tenderness to any need that could be construed as weak. Gareth Tasse was not a cruel man in any deliberate or conscious sense. He was a man who had been made by a particular set of conditions, a cold, undemonstrative father, a culture of industrial masculinity, a genuine belief that softness was the first step toward ruin, and who was reproducing those conditions. Innocent with the unconscious fidelity of someone who knows no other model. He loved Oberon in the way that such men love their children, which is fiercely and inarticulately and in ways that are sometimes indistinguishable from harm. What this meant practically was that Oberon had learned to take up a certain shape in his father's presence, broad and easy and untroubled, and that this shape had over the years become so habitual that he sometimes forgot it was a shape, forgot there was something else underneath. Evander was the only person in Oberon's life in whose presence he could let the shape go, in whose presence he could be uncertain or frightened or tender without it costing him anything. And this made Evander necessary to Oberon in a way that Oberon understood with his whole body long before he let himself understand it with his mind. The first real fracture in the pretense happened in October of the year they were 17, during one of the electrical storms that rolled through Marrow Hollow from the north at that time of year, arriving with theatrical suddenness and turning the sky the color of a bruise. They were in the den. It had good waterproofing by then, a proper roof, a space heater they had liberated from Oberon's garage, and the storm hit without much warning. The kind that turns a drizzle into a downpour in 60 seconds and sends the thunder cracking so close that the ground seems to vibrate under it. Oberon had never liked storms, a fact he had shared with Evander alone and which Evander had never once used against him, not even lightly. Not even in jest, which was a form of love even if neither of them would have called it that. When the thunder cracked directly overhead, Oberon went very still in the way that bracing people go still when something bypasses their composure. And without any decision being made or any words being exchanged, Evander moved from his chair to sit on the ground beside where Oberon was sitting and put his shoulder against Oberon's shoulder, and they stayed like that, side by side on the cold floor of the den while the storm went through. It was not dramatic. Nothing happened. They did not speak. But Evander was aware of every millimeter of contact between his shoulder and Oberon's shoulder with an intensity of attention that was almost painful. And when eventually the storm moved off and the rain softened, Oberon let out a long, slow breath beside him. Evander felt something in his chest that was so large and specific and undeniable that his box, his careful dark box, cracked completely down the center. And the thing inside it came out and he could not get it back in. He went home that night and lay in his bed and said it to the ceiling in a whisper for the first time. The actual words, and the words were both exactly as terrible and exactly as true as he had always suspected they would be. And he lay there with them loose in the room and felt something that was simultaneously the most frightened he had ever been and the most honest. They were 18 when the second fracture happened, at a party thrown by a boy in their class named Whitmore Fell. The kind of party that occupies a specific place in the architecture of adolescence, to many people. Too little light, music played at a volume calculated to make conversation an act of physical exertion. Evander had not wanted to go and had gone anyway because Oberon had wanted to go, and there it was. There was the entire problem in one compact sentence. The party was in Whitmore's basement, and Evander had stationed himself in a corner with a drink he was not really drinking and was in the process of conducting his usual perimeter watch when he became aware, with a sudden, sharp, unpleasant clarity, that a boy he did not recognize was talking to Oberon on the other side of the room. A tall, blond boy with the easy confidence of someone who has always found the world accommodating, and that Oberon was laughing at something the boy said in the particular open-throated way that Oberon laughed, and that the blond boy's hand was on Oberon's arm. What Evander felt in that moment was not ambiguous. It was not something he could file under anything benign. It was jealousy of the most specific and revealing kind, the kind that tells you everything you need to know about yourself in one unguarded second. And it moved through him like a current and left him standing in his corner feeling exposed in a way that made him want to put down his drink and leave and possibly never return. He did not leave. He stayed because he was Evander, and this was what Evander did. He stayed and he endured, and he watched Oberon talk to the blonde boy for 20 minutes, and then he watched the blonde boy leave, and Oberon crossed the room toward him with that walk. That particular loose, unhurried walk, and he assembled his face very carefully before Oberon arrived. "What's wrong?" Oberon said. Not as a question exactly, but as a statement of observation, because Oberon always knew, had always known, this was the particular and unfair talent of the person who knows you most completely. "Nothing," Evander said. Oberon looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that had been reading Evander like a text since they were 5 years old in a garden. And then he said, "Okay," in the tone of voice. "That means I know you're lying, but I'm going to let you lie tonight." And they went home and did not talk about it. But something had been redistributed between them. Some weight had shifted. And they both felt it, and neither of them named it, and the gap between what was felt and what was said began to grow. Slowly, the way a crack grows in a wall, visible only if you look closely, but growing. The year they were 19, they both went to the same university, a middling red brick in a city 3 hours from Marrow Hollow. Oberon for engineering and Evander for English literature, and this ought to have given them room, distance, the perspective that can sometimes let you see a thing you've been too close to. Instead, they got a shared flat with 2 other students, a cheerful catastrophist named Bram Velacourt and a meticulously tidy girl called Thessaly Monk, who regarded their shared kitchen with the vigilance of a health inspector, and their proximity simply continued at university density. The city was different from Marrow Hollow in ways that mattered. There was a particular street in the university quarter where a bar called the Meridian stayed open until 2 in the morning and played music that was not the music of Marrow Hollow and was frequented by people who moved through the world in ways that Evander had never seen people move through the world in Marrow Hollow, with an ease in their own skins that struck him the first time he saw it as both foreign and deeply familiar. Like hearing a word in another language that describes something you have felt your whole life, but had no word for in your own. He started going to the Meridian alone on Thursday nights, which he told Oberon was because he liked the music, which was partially true. He ordered the same drink each time and sat at the end of the bar and watched people and felt, for the first time in his 19 years, not like an anomaly, not like a deviation from a norm, but like a version of something that existed, that had always existed, that had its own long and complicated and often painful history and its own beauty and its own community. He did not tell Oberon about this. He told Oberon he went to the library on Thursday nights, which was the one lie he had ever told Oberon that was not a lie of omission. That was an actual deliberate untruth, and it sat in his stomach like a stone. The crisis, when it arrived in the way that crises between people who know each other that deeply tend to arrive. Not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a small moment that turns out to contain everything. It was a Tuesday night in November of their second year, Bram away for the weekend and Thessaly at a late lecture. Evander and Oberon in the flat alone with takeaway containers and a film neither of them was really watching. They had been quieter with each other for months by then, carrying the weight of all the unsaid things, and the quiet had taken on a different quality from the old easy silence, had acquired an effortfulness, the sense of 2 people choosing their words carefully, around something they were both pretending wasn't there. Evander was aware of it. He was fairly sure Oberon was aware of it. Neither of them had touched it. Then Oberon said, without looking away from the television, "I went to the Meridian on Thursday." Evander went very still. "I saw you," Oberon said, still not looking at him. His voice was entirely level, giving nothing away, the voice he used when he was being most careful. "You weren't at the library." There was a long silence. Evander looked at the side of Oberon's face and felt the floor of the moment tilt beneath him. Felt the careful architecture of 17 years of management begin to shift and creak. And understood that there was no version of the next few minutes that did not change everything. "I know," Evander said. More silence. Oberon reached forward and picked up his drink and held it without drinking from it, turning it slowly in his hands. Something he did when he was thinking hard, that Evander had always known. Would always know. "I've been going there too, Oberon," said different nights. And then, after a pause that contained what felt like the weight of both their childhoods, "I didn't know you knew about it." The thing that happened in Evander's chest in that moment was not describable in any vocabulary he had been given. It was not a simple thing. It was the specific and violent collision of terror and recognition and relief and grief, all of them arriving simultaneously, and he sat very still in its aftermath and breathed carefully and did not say anything for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, very quietly, "How long?" Oberon made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because the question touched something in him that had been coiled tight for too long, and the coiling released a fraction under the direct honest pressure of it. "A long time," Oberon said. "You?" "A long time," Evander said. They sat with that for a moment. Just those words between them, like two objects placed carefully on a table, examined from all sides in the flickering television light. "You should have told me," Oberon said, and his voice was not accusatory, but there was something in it, some thread of hurt. The hurt of someone who has been trusted with everything and has only just discovered there was one room they were never shown. "I know," Eve said, and meant it completely. They did not resolve anything that night. Nothing dramatic happened. They finished their food in a quiet that had changed quality again, had lost its effortfulness, and become something else. Something fragile and new and real, and eventually Oberon went to his room and Evander sat on the sofa for a long time in the dark and thought about the fact that the most frightening things he had ever known were sometimes also the most necessary. What followed was not a tidy progression. Love stories in real life rarely are, particularly when they carry the additional weight of everything that these two boys were carrying: the families, the church, the particular cultural geography of a place like Marrow Hollow that it shaped them both in ways that did not simply stop shaping you because you had moved to a city. They circled each other in the weeks that followed with a new and careful awareness, both of them knowing now that the map had changed. Neither of them entirely sure how to read the new version. There were conversations, halting and honest, the kind where you start 3 times before you find the right words, where you say a thing and then sit with the thing you've said as if listening to it from the outside to check if it's true. Oberon talked about his father in a way he had never talked about his father to anyone. Talked about the specific choreography of hiding, that you learn when the person you most want approval from is also the person most likely to withdraw it if they see you clearly. Evander talked about the church and about the framed cross and about his mother's rosary beads with a specificity that surprised even him, as if these details had been waning, had been filing themselves away all these years in anticipation of this exact conversation. And underneath all of it, beneath the conversations and the histories and the carefully navigated revelations, there was the other thing, the simpler and more urgent thing. The thing that had been building since a shoulder pressed against another shoulder in a storm when they were 17, and probably, if either of them was honest, since long before that. The wanting. The specific, patient, relentless wanting that does not diminish with time but accretes, layer by layer, the way geological things do. until it has its own weight and density and you understand that it is not going away. The night it finally broke. Surfaced the night everything that had been subterranean became undeniable and present and real was in December. 3 weeks before Christmas, when they would both go back to Marrow Hollow and resume the shapes they wore for their families. It had been snowing lightly all afternoon, the first snow of the year, and the city had taken on that specific, muffled quality that snow gives cities. The sound turned down a degree, the ages softened, the familiar streets made briefly strange and beautiful. They had been at a friend's gathering and walked home together through the snow because it was that kind of night, the kind that asks you to walk slowly and look up. And they were talking about nothing important, about the semester, and the cold in a film Bram had recommended. And at some point, between the corner of Aldersgate Street and the door of their building, the conversation had stopped and they were just walking, close together in the cold, and Evander was aware of the exact distance between his hand and Oberon's hand as they walked, aware of it with an almost geometric precision. They stopped outside the building door, and Oberon found his key and then paused without using it. And they stood there in the small snowfall and looked at each other in the way that two people who know each other completely look at each other, when the only thing left is the thing they haven't said yet, and Evander felt his heart doing something complicated and architecturally unsound in his chest. Oberon said his name. Just his name. Evander. The way he had said it 1,000 times since they were 5 years old in a garden. But differently, with a texture to it that was new and unmistakable. And that arrived in Evander's chest, like a key in a lock. And Evander said yes. Not as an answer to a question, because no question had been asked, but as an acknowledgement, a yes to the whole situation, to everything that was currently standing between them in the small falling snow. What happened next was slow and careful, and entirely without the dramatic gestures that stories tend to award such moments. Because real life is not like that. Real love between real people who have been circling each other for 17 years is not a crescendo, it is a door opening. Quietly, the light from inside falling warm and specific across the threshold. Oberon put his hand against Evander's face, his cold hand against Evander's cold cheek, and Evander stood very still and let himself be seen in the way he had never let himself be seen before. Completely, without any management or containment. And what was in Oberon's eyes when he looked at him was so familiar and so enormous that Evander had to look away for a second and then look back. And then Oberon kissed him. Soft and careful and certain, with the confidence of someone who has known for a long time exactly what he wants, but has been waiting until it was right to reach for it. And Evander kissed him back with 17 years of patience in it. 17 years of learning the shape of a person before allowing yourself to love it. And the snow came down around them, and the city was quiet, and the moment was entirely, completely, irreversibly real. They went upstairs, and Bram was out in Thessaly, was asleep, and the flat was theirs and warm, and they sat on the sofa in the lamplight and talked for 2 more hours before anything else happened. Because that was who they were. Because they had never been people who rushed through the words to get to the wordless things. Because the talking was part of it, had always been part of it, was in fact the longest and most essential part of it. Evander told Oberon things he had never told another person, and Oberon told Evander things in return, and the telling felt like a kind of phone coming, like arriving at a place you have been traveling toward for a very long time. And eventually the talking gave way to something else, and the something else was tender and clumsy in the way that first things between real people are always tender and clumsy, shot through with laughter at unexpected moments, punctuated by the kind of small communications that only two people who already know each other deeply can make. A glance and a nod and a quiet yes, and the specific warmth of being held by someone whose arms you have known since you were 5 years old in a guardian but have never known like this close, this real. This unguarded Evander lay awake afterward in the early hours and listened to Oberon breathe beside him and looked at the ceiling and felt something that he would not try to name immediately because he had learned from years of being a person who need to name things in order to keep them at a safe distance, that some things were better felt before they were named. He felt it in his chest and his hands, in the specific way the dark of the room looked, and the exact particular quality of Oberon's breathing beside him, and the snow still falling somewhere outside the window. He thought about Marrow Hollow. He thought about his mother's rosary beads at the bottom of the soapy sink water, which was a thought he kept returning to as a kind of test, pressing the bruise to check its size. He thought about Christmas, about the drive home, about resuming the shapes that their families had made for them, and that they had both been wearing so long the edges had worn smooth. He thought about what it would mean to go back to those shapes now, after this, whether it would still be possible, whether the shape would still fit the person who was currently lying in the warm dark, listening to the snow. He thought it probably would not fit. He thought that was probably the point. Christmas was difficult in the ways he had anticipated, in some additional ways he had not. He and Oberon drove back to Marrow Hollow separately, in their respective family cars, and resumed their respective roles with the practiced ease of long habit. And on the surface nothing was different. They were still neighbors and childhood friends, and the boys who had grown up in the alley between the two gardens. And they saw each other at Christmas Eve. Church. Both their families attended the same church, which had always been one of the small geographical ironies of their situation, and exchanged the specific, careful look of two people who share a secret in a room full of people who must not know it. Oberon's father clapped him on the shoulder and asked about his marks and made a joke about engineers running the world, and Oberon laughed in the right place and said the right things, and Evander watched from across the church hall and understood, with a new and more painful clarity, what it cost Oberon to wear that shape. Now that he had seen what Oberon looked like without it, Evander's mother asked him if he was seeing anyone at university, the way she always asked at Christmas, with the particular careful hopefulness of a parent who wants a specific answer and is phrasing the question to leave room for it. And Evander said no, not really, which was both true and entirely untrue, and his mother said, well, there's time, and touched his arm and went back to her mince pies. They managed one evening alone during the holiday, 3 days after Christmas, when both sets of parents were at separate events, and the street was quiet, and the December dark came down early, the way it does in winter, absolute and early, by 4 in the afternoon. Oberon came to Evander's back door, and Evander let him in, and they stood in the kitchen for a moment with the ordinariness of the kitchen around them, the framed cross above the stove, the ordinary cups on their hooks, and then Oberon crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed him, and the ordinariness of the kitchen became something else entirely. Became a room in which something that mattered was happening. They sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and talked in low voices even though the house was empty. Because old habits and old fears do not dismantle simply because you have decided to be brave, and Oberon said, I've been thinking, and Evander said yes, and Oberon said, I don't want to go back to this, back to the shape my dad wants me to be. I don't think I can anymore. And Evander looked at him across the kitchen table and understood that he meant it, and also understood what it would cost. They stayed in Marrow Hollow for 5 more days of the holiday, and they did not tell anyone, and they went back to the flat in January, and Bram asked why they were both so quiet, and Thessaly said, with her characteristic directness, you two finally sorted yourselves out, didn't you? and they looked at her and then at each other, and Evander started laughing first, and Oberon followed, and Thessaly said, "I have known since literally the first week we moved in here," and poured herself more coffee with the composure of someone whose theory has been satisfyingly confirmed. The months that followed were the best and most complicated of Evander's life, a combination that he had not anticipated. But that made a kind of sense once he was inside it. They were best because Oberon was his in a way that was now acknowledged, real, present, because the 17 years of careful distance had elapsed into something immediate and warm and daily, because he could say things he had spent years not saying and have them received with the ease of someone who had always known they were coming. They were complicated because the world outside the flat had not changed, Marrow Hollow had not changed, their families had not changed, and the question of when and how and whether to close the gap between their private truth and their public life was always present. Sometimes far, sometimes very close. Oberon was the one who moved first, as Evander could have predicted he would be, because Oberon had always been the one who moved toward things, who picked up the beetle in the jar and offered it to strangers, who climbed trees to knock on windows at 11 at night, who went headlong at the world and sorted out the consequences later. In March he told his housemates with a casualness that Evander both admired and found almost physically stressful. Just mentioned it in the context of a conversation about something else. "By the way, Evander and I are together," and then continued, eating his breakfast while Bram made a noise of theatrical excitement, and Thessaly said, "I know. I said that in January." His father was harder. That conversation happened in April, on a Sunday afternoon phone call that Oberon took in his room with the door closed, and Evander sat on the sofa outside and listened to the silences and the measured tones coming through the door and tried to read them the way you try to read the weather from inside, by inference, by the quality of the light. Oberon came out after 40 minutes with a face that was very still and carefully composed, and sat down beside Evander, and Evander took his hand, and they sat like that in silence for a while. "He didn't say much," Oberon said eventually, "just that he needed time, and then, after a pause, he said he didn't know who I was." Evander understood that this was the worst of it for Oberon. Not anger, not rejection, but that particular formulation, "I don't know who you are," coming from a man whose knowing had always mattered, whose recognition had been the thing that Oberon had spent his whole life simultaneously pursuing and pretending not to need. "You're the same person you've always been," Evander said, and he meant this with every specific calibrated certainty he possessed, which was considerable, because if anyone in the world had comprehensive knowledge of who Oberon Tasse had always been, it was Evander Quillethe, who had been collecting that knowledge since he was 5 years old in a garden, looking up at a face framed by dark curls with a beetle in a jar. "I know," Oberon said. "But he doesn't. That's his loss," Evander said. And Oberon looked at him, and something in his face shifted, some tension released, and he leaned his head against Evander's shoulder the way Evander had once pressed his shoulder against Oberon's in a storm. And they sat in the afternoon light of their shared flat with Bram clattering dishes somewhere in the kitchen in the spring, coming in through the cracked window, and the complicated business of being alive and in love continuing around them. Evander told his mother in May, in a phone call that he had rehearsed so many times in his head that the actual version felt both familiar and entirely foreign. He told her plainly, in clear and simple language, because he had learned by then that plainness was a form of respect, that the elaborate hedging and contextualizing he had always used to manage his parents' reactions was, in fact, a way of protecting himself from their actual response, which was a luxury he was no longer willing to afford. He told her, and then he waited. She did not drop anything this time. She was very quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Is this the boy next door?" And Evander said yes, and she was quiet again for even longer. He heard her breathing and then heard something that might have been her sitting down. "I've known that boy since he was 5 years old," she said, finally. "So have I," Evander said. Another silence. Then she said, in a voice that was careful and small, and not entirely steady, "I don't know what the Bible says about this, Evander. I know what the pastor says. I don't know if that's the same thing." This was more than Evander had expected and less than he needed, and exactly the truth of where his mother was. And he held it gently, because it was something, because it was a crack in a wall that had been entirely solid a moment before, and cracks are how the light gets in. He went back to Mara Hollow for the summer with Oberon, the first time they had returned together, knowing what they were returning as. And the geometry of it was different. They were men by then, 20 years old, with a specific gravity. That comes from having survived the first serious tests of who you are and not been destroyed by them. They walked differently than they had the summer before. They spoke differently to their families, not with aggression or performance, but with a new groundedness. A sense of standing in their own stories rather than in the stories others had. Written for them, Oberon's father took weeks to speak to him beyond the minimal and necessary. Evander's mother asked careful questions that were not always the right questions, but that came from a genuine, effortful attempt to understand, which is the thing that matters, which is where all change actually begins, not in the positions people announce, but in the questions they are willing to ask. There was a Sunday afternoon in July, 3 weeks into the summer, when Oberon was in his own garden and Evander was in his. The fence between them, the same fence that had been there since they were 5, and Oberon was doing something practical with a loose fence post, and Evander was reading on a garden chair, and Oberon's father came out into the garden. Evander kept his eyes on his book and listened to the silence between Oberon and his father, which had been a different kind of silence from the old ones all summer. Denser and more effortful, the silence of two people who have not yet found the new way to speak to each other. Then he heard Gareth Tasse say, quietly, in a voice without any of the performance of his usual register, stripped down to something more basic, "Your mom says you're happy." "Yes," Oberon said, after a pause, another silence. Then, "Good," his father said. Just that, just the one word, and then the back door, and the sound of it closing. Evander stared at his book without reading it. He heard Oberon in the garden on the other side of the fence, heard him breathing, heard the specific sound of someone who is trying not to let their feelings become audible. Then Oberon's face appeared above the fence, the same way it had appeared above the fence 17 years ago, round and real and framed by those curls, though the curls were less wild now and the face was older and the eyes had more in them. "Did you hear that?" Oberon said. "Yes," Evander said. Oberon looked at him for a moment, and his face was doing several things at once, the way faces do when they receive something they have been waiting for a very long time and don't quite know how to hold it. Then he said, "I'm going to fix this fence post," and Evander said okay and went back to his book, and they stayed like that in the summer afternoon, on opposite sides of the fence, together. The next several years did not resolve everything. This is not that kind of story, because life is not that kind of story. And Evander had never trusted the version of love that comes pre-packaged with resolution, with the neat closing of all distances. Oberon's father came slowly and unevenly toward his son across the years that followed. 2 steps forward and 1 step back, the way that real changes in real people happen. Not in epiphanies but in accumulated increments, in small decisions made repeatedly over time. Evander's mother went to speak to a different pastor, in a different church. One she had found through a friend of a friend, a man who read the same scripture with different emphasis, and came back with questions rather than answers, which is exactly what questions are for. There were family dinners that were excruciating, and family dinners that were almost ordinary, and the gradation between the two was the actual landscape of their life. The texture of the ongoing and unfinished business of being people inside families that had not chosen the full truth of them but were, some of them, some of the time, trying. Evander and Oberon moved into their own flat when they graduated. A small second-floor place above a bakery in the city that smelled perpetually of bread and in which Oberon's museum box occupied a shelf in the living room, its contents having expanded over the years to include a smooth gray stone from a specific beach, a pressed leaf from a particular autumn, a folded piece of paper with something written on it in Evander's handwriting that Oberon had kept since they were 16 and that Evander did not ask about and Oberon did not explain. They had a life. It was not the life that either of their father's versions of masculinity had provided a map for. It was not the life that the church above the stove or the Sunday mornings or the grace before meals had been pointing toward. It was a life they had built out of 17 years of friendship and all the accumulated weight of knowing someone from the beginning. From the beetle in the jar in the den in the alley and the lamplight in the storm. A life that had been growing underneath the surface of everything else for so long that by the time it broke surface, it was already deep-rooted. Already strong, already entirely itself. Evander sometimes thought about the moment in the snow, outside. Their university building, Oberon's cold hand against his face. And the way that moment had felt both like the beginning of something and like the arrival at something. Because it was both. Because that is what it is to love someone you have known your whole life. The beginning and the arrival are the same. Moment, you started toward each other before you knew you were moving, and you arrived before you knew you had left. There is a photograph on the shelf, beside Oberon's museum box, taken by Thessaly at a birthday dinner the year they were 24, which Evander looks at sometimes when he is passing, not stopping to look at it, just catching it peripherally. The way you catch something in the corner of your eye that is so familiar it has become part of the landscape. In it, Oberon is laughing at something off camera, head thrown back in that way he has, too big for the room. The laugh of someone who has never been able to help it, and Evander is looking at him, not at the camera. At Oberon, he is looking at him the way he has always looked at him when Oberon wasn't watching, the way he looked at him in the den in the lamplight at 16, and in the storm and across church halls in Marrow Hollow and in a university flat on a November night when everything changed. The way he looked at him every time before he had the right to look and all the times since, with 17 years of patient knowledge, and all the love that had been waiting in that box in the dark for so long that by the time it finally came, out it filled every room it entered, the way he has always looked at him, the way he will always look at him.